with you this morning. Of course, I have a soft heart for the Middle East because I was just checking in this morning in the hotel, and then the concierge asked me, "Have you ever been to Dubai before?" So I said, "Yes, before you're born." And indeed, I came here in 1974 for the first time, and there was really practically nothing here. And since then, obviously, the whole region has developed immensely. And I had the privilege to visit most Middle Eastern countries, including Iran and Syria. And so I have, had a very, very nice experience in this region that was also culturally extremely interesting, and that is frequently overlooked by Western observers of the Middle East. But I'm not here to talk about the past. Essentially, I started to work in 1970 on Wall Street, and then in 73 I moved to Asia, and ever since I lived in Asia. But one thing I just wanted to point out, because it relates to the presentation I'm making, in 1970 there was not a single investment bank that was a public company. All of them were private partnerships. And this is important to understand. If you have a private partnership, the risk profile or the risks the partners will take are, of course, of a different nature than if you play with other people's money. And so the whole culture of the investment business has changed enormously, whereas a partner was liable with all his assets for also the other people's mistakes. Today, essentially, if you're running a bank and you run it like a hedge fund, like Citigroup or so, and you go bust, essentially it doesn't hurt you. So that has changed a lot in the financial service industry, and I'll talk about this in a second. What I'd really like to demonstrate today is that the Keynesians, their idea is to intervene into the free market, into the capitalistic system with fiscal and monetary measures, and their idea, or the idea of Keynes, was to smoothen out the business cycle. But I'd like to demonstrate that actually with these interventions, the business cycle has become more violent, we have more extreme fluctuations in economic activity, and we have far more financial volatility. The central problem is that the Keynesian always try to address long-term structural problems with short-run fixes, and the emphasis on creating bubbles to help the economy, whereas the fact is that bubbles usually hurt the majority of market participants. To better understand this, the Federal Reserve's philosophy has been essentially over the last 30 years that you can't identify bubbles. But if a bubble bursts, you can undertake measures that will support asset prices. In other words, in the words of Mr. Bernanke, you can flood the system with liquidity by dropping dollar bills onto the United States, and that will prevent deflationary recessions from happening. I'd just like, as an aside, to mention that deflation is not necessarily bad. It depends on many other factors. But the point is, over the last 25, 30 years, each time there was a problem, the Fed slashed interest rates and injected liquidity into the system, starting with the S&L crisis in 1990, the tequila crisis in 94, and in particular LTCM in 98. When they bailed out, LTCM gave a green signal to Wall Street: leverage up, you will be bailed out. One talked about the Greenspan put, and when Mr. Bernanke became Fed chairman in 2006, the view was that there would be a Bernanke put with a higher striking price. So you get the picture. But I'd like to now clearly explain what the problem of dollar dropping is. You drop dollar bills into this room, the Federal Reserve or any other central banks, and the others have done the same, the ECB and now the Bank of Japan and so forth, and the Bank of England. The problem is they can drop dollar bills and they can essentially more or less determine the quantity. What they cannot determine is what we will do with these dollar bills. And when you increase the quantity of money, there will be symptoms of inflation. The inflation does not necessarily have to show up in wage inflation in the United States or in consumer price increases in the United States. We drop dollar bills onto this stage. The dollar bills essentially can flow down here, or they can flow over there or over there, and then they can create commodities inflation there, or they can create an economic boom here in China with rising wages in China and rising inflation rates in China, or they can create a boom in housing over here or in equities over there. That is essentially what's happening, and the viciousness of this monetary inflation is that when we drop the dollar bills into this room, not every price will go up at the same rate and with the same intensity and at the same time. So what we will have is, say, you first have a NASDAQ bubble, 98 to 2000, March 2000, whereas when essentially the NASDAQ between August 99 and March 2000 doubled, but Mr. Greenspan couldn't see a bubble. And then the market collapsed, so they slashed interest rates here from 6.5% down to 1%. And we had a rapid credit expansion, and that created the housing bubble. And so first the NASDAQ bubble, then the housing bubble. The housing bubble also burst, and then they slashed again interest rates here to zero at the present time. And at the same time that they slashed interest rates in 2007, 2008, commodity prices went ballistic, to a peak in July 2008 when oil went up from the time they started to cut interest rates here, $78 to $147 in July 2008. And as I mentioned, you increased the financial volatility by printing money. So from the peak of $147 in July 2008, oil then dropped within 6 months to $32 in December 2008. That is the consequences of easy monetary policies. And this genius who populates the Federal Reserve says, if it were possible to take interest rates into negative territory, I would be voting for that. You know what negative interest rates are? Is you have a deposit of $100,000 with a bank, and after a year you only get back $90,000. But it's been discussed in the economic literature